Hello and welcome back to the Reactivist podcast. I'm Marlena Shaldo. I'm not sure if you caught this, but on The View, Sunny Hostin was talking about why she thinks Donald Trump wants to cut the Department of Education.
It's not really about saving money.
No.
I think there's a much more nefarious reason for it. I think it's because without education, you get cheaper labor. I think what they want to do is create in the United States a permanent underclass, a permanent cheap workforce, because educated workers cost more. That is the bottom line, and that's what they're doing.
That is a pretty strong opinion and quite the indictment, if you ask me. Let's start with the fact that Sunny Hostin is contradicting herself, because it wasn't too long ago where she said that President Trump just wants to deport all undocumented workers. Historically, undocumented workers or immigrants that are new to the country who don't have an education or a formal education are the people who are doing the quote unquote jobs that Americans don't want. Hence, cheap labor. So if they want to cut education in order to maintain cheap labor, why would they also be deporting people who are already considered the cheap laborers? There's something in between those two theories that aren't really adding up for me. Think of it this way. Take it off of the government level. If you were spending too much in your own household, or if you had a company that was moving into the red or in the red, you would do a full audit of all your expenditures and you would figure out what can be cut. This is obviously way more complicated on the government level, but it's still, I think, an essential exercise that needs to be done. What does add up for me is the amount of money and the amount of spending that our government is doing and what Elon Musk and Doge has uncovered since Trump took office. But let's just focus on the Department of Education. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, the Department of Education makes up 4% of government spending, which amounts to $268 billion. Billion with a B. That's a lot of pocket change.
What he's doing is really taking money from kids who really need it in the field. And these departments, yes, they can be much more efficient, but that's what the education department does. It gives out money to kids so you can feed them a decent lunch, so we can have, tutors for reading, so you can actually help kids with math problems. That's what's going on right now. Instead of actually trying to say to states and localities, you got to spend more, which, they should, let's actually have federal dollars that help kids who are poor. Let's actually have federal dollars that help kids who are disabled. Let's actually have federal dollars if career tech ed is important for that kind of things. So what the Department of Education does is it's a supplement that actually really helps kids. And if you ask any teacher in America and you say to them Title I, they're like, oh my God, we need those funds to help kids.
About 14% of the spending from the federal Department of Education goes towards what she's talking about. 14% of the $268 billion. So you could keep that percentage for those particular programs and still cut spending in other areas of the Department of Education. There is a way to cut spending, excess spending, and not chop off everybody's legs from under them at the same time. I think to do a full audit is to see what is a necessity versus what is a non-necessity. I mean, I think that's fair. There are things that are essential, and then there are things that are non-essential. So what Weingarten is talking about could be considered essential, right? You're talking about impoverished areas, public schools who need federal funding. Fine, we'll consider that essential. But I'm sure there's a whole host of non-essential spending that's going on within the department where they don't need $268 billion in tax dollars. We know all about what's essential and non-essential. I mean, you could just go back to 2020. Where were all of these voices from the Democratic Party when so many of the blue states decided what should and shouldn't be considered essential? Liquor stores were essential businesses, essential liquor stores, which I would agree with, but that's not the point. That was an essential business, but privately owned gyms and fitness centers, that wasn't essential. So alcohol was essential, but staying healthy through exercise was non-essential. We can talk about how essential and non-essential hurts people, but if you're going to talk about it, let's talk about all of it, not just the percentage of schools that need funding because they are in low income areas. I'm not disagreeing with Randy Weingarten, but there's a larger conversation to be had here when it comes to deciding what is on the chopping block. USAID, Medicaid, $50 million in condoms to wherever. Now that the Republicans are in charge of what is on the chopping block, they don't like it. But it was okay when they put people out of business based on what they considered essential and non-essential. Food for thought. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an economist, but hear me out. In the US, we have approximately 350 million people. Of those 350 million, we have around 275 million who are adults, people who are 18 and older. If you took 275 million away from $268 billion, you would still have billions of dollars left over in the Department of Education to either leave in place or distribute in other ways. But with that 275 million, you could literally give every adult in the US $1 million. Now, I'm not suggesting you give them $1 million as a lump sum, because then that would cause other economic implications in terms of the value of a dollar. However, you could come up with a plan where you pay each of these adults $50,000 a year for 20 years, which would come to $1 million at the end of those 20 years. You could tax that money because it would be considered income. Mind you, in many households, there are more than one adult living there, right? So you could have a household of two adults who are now getting an influx of $100,000 a year for 20 years. That could definitely soften the blow when it's time to send your children to school. You wouldn't need so much funding from the Department of Education because you could put some money aside, or all of it aside, depending on your situation, and then just pay for college. Am I right? Many of these Americans are senior citizens. They may not make it for 20 years. So all the money owed to them could trickle down to the generations coming behind them. So we're putting more money back into the hands of American citizens while still keeping billions in government spending, however they want to do it. Again, I know I'm not solving the Department of Education abolition in this scenario, but I just can't imagine that if what I just said came true, I don't think anyone would be complaining about either eliminating the Department of Education or at least cutting back the spending that the Department of Education has access to. Am I wrong? Now, what does $50,000 a year for every American adult do to the economy? This may jam up the economy in some way. Does it cause inflation? It can't really solve that particular issue that might arise with giving people this type of money, but there has to be a way. If everything that's coming out of Washington right now is 100% legitimate, and the numbers that they are putting out there in terms of spending that we have done, I just wonder what it will take for Americans to kind of get their hands on some of that money for themselves. Mind you, this country's in debt. So that part has to get fixed first. But there has to be a way to take some of that money and filter it back into the hands of Americans. I feel like that's a happy medium. The government is still making out in terms of money that they have in their pockets. But I think where Elon Musk comes into play and where the Trump administration comes into play with trying to cut excess spending, unnecessary spending, and to uncover fraud, I think it's a pretty good starting point. And I don't agree with what Sunny Hostin is saying. I don't think the reason for getting rid of the Department of Education has anything to do with trying to keep people uneducated in order to lower the cost of labor. Is anybody paying attention? Is Sunny Hostin paying attention to the net worth of some of the Democrats that are in Washington? How is it that Elizabeth Warren makes a salary of $200,000, yet her net worth is $12 million? If she is so invested in the American people and helping the American people, if she is a supporter of welfare, well, Elizabeth Warren, can you tell us how you parlayed $200,000 a year into $12 million? And of that $12 million, how much are you giving back to the American people? And that's just one example of many. So I don't think there's anything quote unquote nefarious going on. I think that nefarious things have gone on, which is why there is a new set of eyeballs on how our tax dollars have been spent and seemingly squandered.